Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so glad to see you all in good health after such a long, hot summer. Well, the summer is over now, so we have to resume our ordinary business. This morning, we invited a very special guest speaker who will best enlighten us on global economic and financial affairs and policies and challenges, particularly European, the crisis or Eurozone crisis. Mr. Charles Dallara has been with us a number of times before, so I don't think he needs a long introduction. Nevertheless, I will say a few words about his outstanding career. Before doing so, I just want to recognize only a few of special guests sitting in the audience, and we have the Minister Kwan Tae-sin, who is currently the Vice Chairman of Presidential Council on National Competitiveness, and then Mr. Kwan, and the National Assemblyman, Mr. Lee Jae-young. Actually, he was here. He's one of the young political leaders, and also we have Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He is one of the busiest men in Seoul now. And we have many others, but and also we have the guest from the diplomatic corps, including ambassador from Pakistan. Thank you very much. Forgive me not to introduce everyone, but we can go on all morning. Well, Charles Dallara has been with managing director for many years. More importantly, he has been my friend for many years when he was senior U.S. Treasury official in the 1980s. Dallara served as managing director of the Institute of International Finance since July 1993. And as you know, the Institute represents more than 450 global financial institutions, including many of the world's largest banks, investment banks, and asset management firms. In fact, Charles Dallara, actually he just came from Europe, but he led the IIF on behalf of the international financial community in the whole process of the negotiation between European governments and the European Central Bank and other financial organizations. In fact, he got involved in what is called the largest sovereign debt restructuring in history, which has to do with the Greek sovereign debt restructuring. He has been involved personally, very deeply in this whole process of resolving European crisis. And so I'm sure he will tell us a lot about what's going on there with the outlook of the crisis itself. Before he joined the IIF, he was managing director at J.P. Morgan and Company. He was head of the Morgan Investment and Commercial Banking business on Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union and Middle East, Middle Africa, Middle East and Africa and India. And then he was in the U.S. public service. He served in various capacities, the U.S. Treasury. But during the 1980s, he served as the very senior official positions in Treasury. Then he was Assistant Secretary he was appointed by the President Bush, right, Senior Bush, right, as Assistant Secretary for International Affairs. Before then, he was international policy-related areas in Treasury. That is the time he came to Korea quite often in the late 80s, and we became friends since then. Well, I can go on, but with this, I will just invite Mr. Dallara to share his insights on these global issues and the current financial affairs in the world. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you very much, Sagong. It's a real pleasure to be back in Seoul and to be honored again with the opportunity to share with you some thoughts at this IGE Samsung Forum. I've been privileged to not only to have had a long-time friendship with Sagong, but also to have worked with him during his years in government recently, as he played a key role in this outgoing government, but also years ago, as he mentioned, when I was in the Treasury and he served as finance minister, and we worked together on a variety of issues, including, if I recall, Korea's exchange rate. Of course, I'm always glad when you invite me when it's not February, because I seem to recall that somehow we ended up in our most difficult discussions during February. And Seoul and Korea in general can be a pretty tough place in February. But it's nice to be back here. Obviously, this is a special country for me for many reasons, not the least of which is that my daughter was born here in 1984, and I recall that during after one of my rather difficult set of discussions with Dr. Eel, that he concluded the discussions by presenting a small bag of gifts to my daughter, and that made it very easy for me to go home with warm feelings about Korea, which have never changed. Of course, we live in a very challenging world today, and I can recall visiting Korea just some 5 years ago, right on the eve of the Lehman Brothers decision. This time of year, of course, in the United States, people tend to remember 9/11 for good reason, because it was a traumatic moment for the world. But mid-September, I also tend to remember the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which I think we're still suffering from. I think it was one of the most misguided decisions in modern financial history to allow Lehman to go under. And I'm afraid that we're at a moment in global finance today where were we faced with a situation similar to that again today, policymakers might well find it difficult to step in and stabilize a global financial institution. Perhaps they may find it difficult to do what they should do because of all of the constraints that have been developed around the governmental support for banks and financial institutions. It's an interesting and important question to think about, because here we stand today, 5 years after the onset of the crisis, 4 years after the collapse of Lehman, and we're still struggling to achieve global economic recovery. There are a lot of reasons for that, of course, and there is a lot being done to try to deal with the weakness in the global economy. Recently, we've seen rather impressive actions in the last day, in the last hours, of course, actions by the Federal Reserve, launching a new round of quantitative easing, non-traditional monetary policy to support the U.S. economy. Last week, we saw potentially significant action by the European Central Bank, where they have outlined what could also be quite an aggressive program of liquidity support for struggling governments in Europe. Of course, there's a big difference, a huge difference, which I think markets may not be fully appreciating, because markets have reacted very bullishly to both of these measures. But if you look at the fine print in the ECB's announcements, you realize that, yes, they may have announced the construction and the launching of a battleship, but they said that before they bring it to the battlefront, that a whole range of other actions need to be taken. And so for the time being, market participants and all of us will have to watch that financial battleship sit on the sidelines, circling, waiting for the governments of Europe to get their act together. It may be it's worth us spending a few moments today concentrating on the European sovereign debt crisis for two reasons. Fundamentally, because I think it is at the heart of today's global economic weakness. You feel this in Korea. I'm going over the weekend to spend some days with friends and collaborators in China. They feel it in China. Just talking with friends from Brazil, they feel it in Brazil. Certainly, investors and consumers in America feel the clouds of uncertainty that hang over them due to the irresolution of the European sovereign debt crisis. Obviously, the sense one has, and I've only been here for less than 24 hours now, so I am by no means fully current on your situation, but one has the feeling that the sluggishness in the Korean economy is very clearly related to the sluggishness in Europe. Yes, primarily through the Chinese connection, but still very clearly related, and I know it must be a big source of concern here. Certainly when I talk to not just bankers and financial leaders, but businessmen in the United States, they stress the difficulty of expanding capital investment in a world characterized by such uncertainty. And I think we should therefore realize how pivotal a resolution of European problems will be for the global outlook. Notwithstanding the fact that many other countries, including, of course, my own country in the United States, and your neighbors, China and Japan, also have a lot to say about the future of the global economy. I also will share some thoughts about Europe because I have spent so much time there in the last 2 years. I feel like I've moved there. At the end of one of the round of negotiations, Chancellor Merkel of Germany said to me, "Well, Mr. Dallara, we haven't always agreed, but I think on the whole, you've done an excellent job representing the interest of the financial community and showing concern about the future of Europe. And perhaps we should therefore award you an honorary European citizenship." And she turned to her staff and said, "Can we do that?" And they said, "Well, Madam Chancellor, there's no such thing as an honorary European citizenship." And I said to her rather sheepishly, maybe because there's no such thing as a European citizen. But in truth, that's the reality. So much of the story of Europe today can be told through the prism of the tensions between national concerns, parochial perspective, nationally elected leaders trying to stabilize their own backyard, trying to deal with their own political futures, while still trying to forge progress toward this grand vision of Europe. And there is a dramatic tension there and has been growing. You see the re-election of the government in the Netherlands yesterday, but you can also see that the Netherlands, which was long time one of the most pro-European countries, has shown increasing tendencies in recent years to pull away from its commitment, to become a very vocal Eurosceptic. And I think this is symptomatic of the difficulty Europe is having. Of course, some of that revolves around the difficulty any political leaders will have supporting other countries during a time of malaise and economic weakness at home. We see this in all of our economies. And of course, some of it has to do, however, with the unfortunate failure of European leaders decades ago to erect, conceive, and develop a structure for Europe which brought fiscal unification alongside monetary unification. Many European leaders called for this. In fact, previous chancellors of Germany called for this, but it didn't happen. And I think to a certain extent, Europe and we all are paying the price for that. Of course, markets have a role to play here as well in the debacle which surrounded Greece and which surrounds Europe today, because investors, and not just banks, although certainly many banks were there, and I might just say we were asked to lead the investor group on behalf of all investors in the Greek negotiations because so many of them were our members. But the reality is that many investors around the world invested in sovereign debt in Southern Europe, in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy, with little regard for the sovereign risk involved, with little regard for the fact that underlying those appealing spreads in Greek debt some years ago was a profound risk. And at the end of the day, it should have been no surprise, of course, that they were not able to realize full value as a result of the negotiations. Indeed, as you've already heard, the Greek debt restructuring was the largest sovereign debt restructuring in history. And we, through a negotiated settlement, through a voluntary deal, gave away 73% of the value of our claims. Over 107 billion euro in face value was wiped out, and 35% of the remaining face value of the debt was converted into long-term paper with very low interest rates. This was necessary to create a window of opportunity for Greece, to give them some breathing space because they were being crushed by their debt. And at a time when it is not easy to hear complimentary remarks about Greece, I will say a couple of things. I admired their dedication to reaching this agreement voluntarily. This is very important for how the system works, because a little over a decade ago, a rather important Latin country, Argentina, also faced an insurmountable debt. But rather than working its debt problems out cooperatively, they took a unilateral approach to their creditors. And as you well know here in Korea, when difficulties, either at the corporate level or at the sovereign level, arise between debtors and creditors, they're always best sorted out cooperatively through long and sometimes difficult negotiations. And that's what we did in the Greek case. It is not what Argentina did, and they still suffer today for failure to access global capital markets. And here I would give a great deal of credit to two former prime ministers, Papandreou and Papademos, both of whom showed a commitment to a negotiated solution when it could have been tempting to simply walk into the creditors and say, no mas, we're not paying you anymore, not a cent, not a euro, we're simply going to default. But it would have been dangerous, not just for Greece, but for Europe as a whole. A disorderly default of Greece could have thrown Europe into chaos. And I, for one, believe that a Greek exit today still has the potential to throw Europe into chaos. Many debate this. Many say, oh, the markets are prepared, the governments are prepared. But a few simple facts makes you realize that is not the case. The ECB claims on Greece are roughly double the size of the ECB's capital base. Greece exits the euro, redenominates its currency back to drachma or some 21st century version of it. And what value do those claims have? What value does the capital stock of the ECB have? Now you can say the governments of Europe would need to recapitalize the ECB quickly, and they would. But could this be done in an orderly fashion? These same governments who moan and groan about an additional 10 or 20 billion euro, are they going to be able to write a check overnight for 200 billion euro? I doubt it. That is not even taking account of the potential contagion effects which a Greek exit would have on Spain, on Italy, on Portugal, potentially on France and other countries. The fiscal construct of Europe today is quite fragile. And after long and hard negotiations, I am pleased that we were able to put into place a solid piece of work rescheduling the private debt. It was difficult not just because of the severity of Greece's economic problems, and it is one of the most inefficiently structured economy I've ever seen. You know, for years, during my Treasury days, during my J.P. Morgan days, and during my years at the Institute, I've worked with many, many sovereigns. And I've seen some poorly organized economies in my day. I've seen some poorly managed economies. I've seen some misguided economic policies. But I've rarely seen an economy so inefficiently structured at its core. At its core is Greece. They have a huge amount of work to do. And frankly, the process of negotiating a solution on this Greek debt was so difficult that I began to learn that in order to sustain my morale, I always asked for a room at my hotel which had at least a small view of the Acropolis. Because after a long and discouraging day at the Prime Minister's residence, I would come back and look at the light shining on the Acropolis, and suddenly I would think, well, maybe we can get something done here in this country. I needed that extra dose of inspiration, because without it, it was not easy at times to sustain the energy and the focus needed to bring these negotiations to a successful conclusion. One other difficulty, though, which hovers over Europe today, and I was just talking with your Vice Minister, the former ambassador there, who probably knows this as well or better than I do, is the dysfunctional decision-making process of Europe today. You have the Eurozone, 17 countries. They have the EU, 27. They can't seem to get a comfortable position between the two now, particularly with one important EU member that is not Eurozone, the UK. But you have other Scandinavian countries which are at various stages of engagement in this process. Some members of the EU, not members of the Eurozone, others good neighbors but not even members of either construct. You've got Switzerland in the middle there trying to look left, right, front and back and keep its head above water. And you've got a decision-making apparatus which is not suitable for today's modern world of finance. Every country in the Eurozone had to approve every dimension of this Greek debt restructuring. And that is patently absurd. If you imagine, I had a call one day after long and difficult negotiations over one technical piece of this deal. The deal related to a GDP warrant, which is an upside kicker which the creditors would receive if growth in Greece exceeds expectations. Greece accepted the rationale for this because we said we're giving away so much of our claims because you have a very weak capacity to repay your claims. But if your future capacity is enhanced, then perhaps you could remember us and send us a little extra money along the way. And they agreed. It's sensible, and it's been done in other cases. But then the Dutch finance minister, the Germans approved it, the French approved it, the IMF approved it, but the Dutch finance minister rang me up and said, well, I will veto this. And I said, why would you possibly do that? He said, well, my staff tell me that it's too favorable for the private creditors. And I said, well, do you really understand how it works? He said, no. And I said, well, look, I've been working on this days and nights with the Greek prime minister, and we finally found a solution. And I need your approval because every one of the ministers has to approve it. And we need it by tomorrow in order to get full approval of the Eurozone ministers at a meeting taking place. And I said, if you do not understand it and you require it, I will get on the plane tonight and we will spend 3 hours tomorrow because that's what it will take, 3 hours, for me to explain the technical details of this to you. And I will try my best to convince you that it is a balanced, fair approach. I said, if you don't have 3 hours on your calendar in the morning, then please concede that this deal should go ahead. And he quickly acknowledged that he did not have 3 hours to carve out, and he ran up the white flag and agreed to this proposal. But I should have never been in a position, and the Greeks should have never been in a position to have to defend every technical piece of this negotiation with every government in Europe. The politics run very high in Europe today, as they do in many countries. The populism runs quite high. The parochialism runs quite high. It runs high in my own country. In spite of these difficulties, I believe that Europe is making progress. And I would say that the actions of the ECB last week are potentially a turning point. But only potentially, because now the governments will have to decide how to get their part of this solution in place. Immediately, you need Spain to ask for a program, and that is proving very, very difficult. We've been working with the Spanish authorities, and we have been struggling to convince them that it's in their interest to seek a program here, because the tap of ECB liquidity, the big guns on the deck of the ECB battleship, will not be used unless Spain goes to Brussels and says, we want a program. There are various political reasons why the Spanish are hesitant, but I believe in the end of the day they will have to swallow their political pride. It's not easy. You learned that in Korea 14 years ago, right? Swallowing political pride is not easy. The U.S. pride was hurt when the rating agencies started looking negatively at us because we couldn't deal with our fiscal debt ceiling last year. Korean pride was hurt when you had to swallow an IMF program. But once you decided to do that, you put all of your energy and your focus into it and managed to use it as an opportunity to strengthen the underlying competitiveness of the Korean economy. This is what Spain, Italy, Greece, and many other countries need to do today. The move toward a banking union is a positive one. But again, so many pieces of this European puzzle remain unresolved. It's one thing to put a Eurozone-wide or an EU-wide umbrella over banking supervision. It's another thing to decide who will pay the price if a large French or Spanish or Italian bank fails. Is it the French or Spanish or Italian taxpayers? Or is it all the Eurozone, all the EU taxpayers? These issues are not even addressed in this current proposal. And of course, nothing that is being done today in Europe suggests to me that there is a consensus toward fiscal union and a vision toward what Europe should look like economically and politically in 15 or 20 years. Without that medium-term game plan, it is highly unlikely that markets will be assuaged on a continuing basis. There needs to be a combination, therefore, of short-term actions by Spain, resolving the current tensions that surround Greece, supporting Portugal and Ireland. There needs to be progress on the banking supervision, but there needs more than anything else to be a coherent medium-term goal that is articulated by European leaders. That, unfortunately, remains very, very elusive. The other difficulty which Europe faces today is a difficulty that we see in so many parts of the world. No growth. It is very hard, and I would say in the end, virtually impossible to regain a comfortable level of debt to GDP once you have a high debt level if your economy is contracting. It's a basic fact of economic law. If your economy continues to shrink, you can take a whack at the debt, but before you know it, the economy's shrinkage offsets the improvements you're making in the debt and makes it more difficult to achieve further debt reduction because of the lack of revenues. There's an old children's story in the U.S. about a tiger that chased his tail around a maple tree so long that the tiger turned into maple syrup. Well, in a way, this is what Europe is doing right now by requiring so much emphasis on short-term budget cutting that they're actually undermining the longer-term goals of fiscal consolidation and debt sustainability. You take every ounce of wind out of the sails of even the most impressive sailing boat, it will not go anywhere. It will sit in the doldrums. And this is unfortunately part of the problem which Europe faces today. Too much emphasis on near-term fiscal belt tightening and not enough on medium-term structural reforms. It comes back to the issue of competitiveness. There is lacking today in European governments, and unfortunately in some sectors of the European corporate leadership, a culture of competitiveness. And until the governments decide that they want to create truly competitive economies that can compete with Korea, that can compete with China, that can compete with Brazil and the United States, then these problems in Europe will continue to hover all of us. Just a moment or two on the U.S. and this part of the world, and then I'd like to conclude on a thought about global coordination. The U.S., as you are, is facing an election quite soon. There's nothing unusual about that. We've been doing it now for 230-odd years. But we seem increasingly unable to find political leaders who are able to work with others across the aisle to find common ground on how to solve our medium-term fiscal problems. And the urgency is growing. If you want to worry about a country with debt sustainability problems, don't worry about Greece. Don't worry about Italy. Don't even worry about Japan. Worry about the United States. Because the outlook for our debt to GDP ratio as we move through this decade is quite bleak unless we can solve our medium-term entitlements problems. The debate which you see now between the political parties over benefits and government spending on the one hand and tax increases on the other hand is an important political debate. But the real issue is that, like Europe, we have created an atmosphere of entitlements in our economy, which are not sustainable by the current tax structure and would only be sustainable with heavy, heavy additional doses of taxes on U.S. citizens and U.S. corporations. And I doubt whether that is very compatible with a competitive, thriving U.S. economy. We will face some difficult decisions soon, and everyone can look at this so-called fiscal cliff and say, the politicians will find solutions. But it's not that easy. They need to find solutions that not only enable the current growth to be sustained, but they need to find solutions that will give confidence to markets that the medium-term problems are under control. And that's not going to be easy, and I've seen little evidence so far that leaders in either party are really prepared to roll up their sleeves and do what it takes. There's another feature in the global outlook which warrants a brief word, and that has to do with deleveraging and regulatory reform. I was in Jackson Hole a few weeks ago when Chairman Bernanke of the Fed gave this speech where he telegraphed pretty clearly his intention to do what he did yesterday. And the next morning I had the opportunity over breakfast to discuss with him the ineffectual nature of U.S. monetary policy, because it has certainly given markets a lift. But the housing market in the U.S. still remains weak, although showing finally some signs of recovery. Credit availability for small and medium-sized enterprises and many households is still highly constrained. And the pressures on financial institutions to reduce their balance sheets and build capital are quite substantial. This is an American reality. It's a European reality. You know it very well because it was part of the G20 agenda for a number of years. Well, it is all well and good to strengthen the regulatory framework, and I think we would all acknowledge that after the crisis of 2007, 2008, that higher capital and liquidity requirements are needed. But are we not overdoing it? Is the regulatory pendulum not swinging so hard, so fast, that what Bernanke and his colleagues are trying to do with easy money is being partly undermined by his own regulatory policies? They tend to view this in the U.S. and in many governments as totally independent features of policymaking. And the finance ministries around the world, with all respect to my friends here in Korea and my former colleagues at the U.S. Treasury, seem unable or unwilling to rein in the regulatory excesses. Why? Because it's popular to beat on bankers. Of course it is. It's popular for politicians all over the world to blame the banking community not just for its role in this crisis, and let's acknowledge it, the banking community did play a role in catalyzing and planting some of the seeds for this crisis which enveloped the world 4 years ago. Poor risk management, poor governance standards, inappropriate compensation structures, weak underwriting standards. All of these were weaknesses in the financial community. But did we really have a global economic crisis solely because of those factors? I think any rational analysis suggests not. Misguided policies, weak regulation, inadequate supervision clearly played a role. Global imbalances played a role. But you won't hear that being said by any global political leader because it's more popular to blame the bankers and then pile on regulatory reform. You cannot rebuild the global economy unless the political leaders realize that financial institutions are their partners, not their enemies. And this is partly a task of the political leaders. It's partly a task of the financial community itself to steadily work to rebuild its own credibility, and this is not easy to do. Mistakes continue to be made, as we've seen this summer. Credibility continues to be damaged. But just as the Korean banking community has rebuilt its credibility impressively, after the role that they played in the crisis here some 14 years ago. So the global banking community has a job to rebuild its credibility, and frankly, the banks from the U.S. and Europe can learn from what emerging market banks have done to strengthen their balance sheets, to strengthen their risk management, to rein in highly risky activities. On a final point, I reflect on the impressive and remarkable work which you did working with President Lee in chairing the G20 a few years ago, and I reflect upon the evolution of the G20 process. The fact is that the G20 has done some useful things in the last few years, but it is still not making enough of a difference in creating a framework for coordination of global economic policies. National policymakers still seem to feel that their obligation is not just first and foremost to their own country, but first, foremost, and solely. Now, that's a bit of an exaggeration because there are, at times, efforts at global coordination and cooperation, but they're weak, they're insufficient, and they seem to deny the reality of the interdependence which surrounds global economic and financial structures today. Korean businessmen do have a right to be concerned about the policies of China and the U.S. and Germany. Brazilian businessmen do have a right when they complain about QE2 because it creates liquidity which drives their exchange rate and undermines their competitiveness. There are no easy solutions, but unless we in the global economic and financial system strengthen the framework for coordination of policy making, I'm afraid that our future will continue to be marked by episodic and painful and costly economic and financial crises. Thank you for having me with you here this morning. It's a real pleasure to be back, and I'll be delighted to participate in the Q&A. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for very, very illuminating and an insightful presentation on global financial and economic affairs, and particularly European crisis, current European crisis. You covered a wide range of issues for which I'm sure there will be many questions and comments from the floor. So, yeah, please raise your hand. And yes, Minister Kwon, yes, and then Dr. Kim.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dallara. I mean, we learned a lot from first-hand experience and in the dealing the Greek debt issues. As you have said, I think the Greek problem and the Southern European economic problem is not just the issue of liquidity problem. It's issue, as you said, insolvency. How to overcome insolvency problem? The only way is to enhance your productivity or depreciate your currency. But depreciation is not possible when you are in Europe. Then there should be enhancing productivity by reform in the government or entitlement program or social welfare system. But it is very difficult and it cannot be done. And by using the tight fiscal policy, as you have said, it will reduce the economy and then more difficult to get benefit. I'm with you. But please tell me, what is your forecast? How can they solve their problem? When? Because even if we had experienced the Korean financial crisis, Lehman Brothers crisis, or a Great Depression, every time we have find ways to overcome. I think we should be more optimistic. But in this case, how can you be optimistic? And I really think about it over and over. What if Greek came out of euro and used all the drachma? Then that would make a big problem also, because the issues of creditor and debtor in denominated euro, how can they change it? And then it is a big shock and also a big contagion. But without doing that, then Germany or rich northern European country, every year they need to give the help every year. How can they continue? And then, as I said, there is no way to enhance productivity or solve insolvency problem. So what do you think the future picture within just 2-3 years later? They can solve it, or Greeks will go out of the Eurozone? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Why don't you invite Dr. Kim's
Please.
question or comments again? Yeah.
I'm Professor Kim of Seongyungan University. I thank you for your insightful presentation. I have two questions. One is about the third round of QE. There's a criticism about Bernanke's, although you call it a non-traditional monetary policy, because at the present time the real interest rate is negative. If the interest rate is between 0 and 1%. So I would like to hear your comment on what's going to happen, because they're afraid that that's going to invite more serious problem later on. And another question is about the euro crisis. Czech President Václav Klaus expressed a great concern that currently the free market capitalism is greatly being challenged. He sensed that socialism is coming back in Europe. So I wonder if you were able to sense that when you were in Europe. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, just one more. Yes, please. There's one more person. Yes.
My name is Mario Krompoets. I'm the Deputy Head of Mission of the Netherlands. I just would like to make one small addition. I certainly do not deny the great amount of Euroscepticism in Europe, and it's not going to change over the coming months, years, because the problems are just too big. It's just that the outcome of the elections in the Netherlands, at least I think for many people in the Netherlands, and I hope it's going to be a small sign for Europe as well, is a clear choice of the public for the center, for stability and for Europe. And I don't say that it's a clear choice for the Eurozone, because the parties in the center have a slight difference of opinion on that, how to continue, if you should continue paying for Greece, for everything. But for me at least, and for many others, it's a sign that the Netherlands is going for stability and for Europe in general. And I just hope it's a positive sign, a small one, the Netherlands is small, for the rest of Europe.
Well, let me try to respond first on your very poignant question about competitiveness. What is the answer? How can one be optimistic? Like you, I try to maintain a certain degree of optimism, because it's the only way to keep getting up with energy in the morning, isn't it? It is difficult to be optimistic, but nevertheless, I remain hopeful and somewhat optimistic that Europe will forge ahead by finally realizing the need to come to grips with these competitiveness issues. If you look at Greece, one astounding reality is that private sector wages have taken such a hit over the last 2.5 to 3 years that they have regained almost half of the competitiveness through unit labor costs that they lost during the prior decade of outlandish wage increases. And if they can get some control over government salaries, which they're struggling to do, then I think you will find that this creates a window toward competitiveness. But it will need to be supplemented by much, much more than that. The protective structures which surround professional industries make it very difficult for entrepreneurs and new entrants to break into a wide range of economic activity in Greece today. The lack of a culture of tax compliance is a profound structural and cultural problem that is much worse in Greece than any other country in Europe, although we see signs of it in other countries. The overall competitiveness issues surrounding labor market rigidities in Spain, in Italy, in Portugal, these are finally being recognized, and I think over the long run, leaders in Europe will have to recognize that many of the benefit structures and many of the protective devices that they have surrounding the labor market are really and not at all compatible with long-run competitiveness in their economies. If you talk to French businessmen today, they're extremely critical of both the prior government and this new government's approach toward raising more and more taxes and creating more and more constraints around corporate activity, around the labor market movements, in particular in France today. There is, in the end, no way to avoid the necessity of being competitive if you want to maintain levels, reasonably socially stable levels of employment. Today, the levels of unemployment in Greece, in Spain, to a lesser extent in Portugal and Ireland, are frightening. Not just frightening from an economic point of view, they're frightening from a social democratic point of view. The splinter party that almost took control of Greece this spring, radical, somewhat irrational, came into being with such force not just because they had a charismatic young leader, but because the parties which had governed Greece alternately for the last decades are really discredited by the Greek people. They welcome privatization, by the way, and I think privatization also holds promise, but I don't yet see it on the agenda sufficiently in Greece, in Portugal, in Italy, in Ireland as it needs to be. I think your concern about long-term competitiveness is very valid, and I share it, but I do think that there is growing recognition that unless the structural rigidities that surround parts of the European economy are broken, that their capacity to sustain jobs for their people in the coming decades is going to be increasingly constrained. Korea's not going away. China's not going away. America's not going away with its competitiveness edge. And obviously, all these countries have their own difficulties, but I think that this issue of competitiveness is one that has to come into the forefront. QE, I myself am a bit ambivalent. I question the potential effectiveness of a new round of asset purchases. I think to a certain extent it shows a matter of frustration and a degree of inability of the leadership in Washington to find the right course with fiscal and structural policies, and so another round of QE becomes a substitute for that. As I mentioned, I also think that there is a real question as to the compatibility of the current excesses of regulatory reform with the provision of credit. What is all this QE about? It's about trying to make a lot of credit available at cheap prices, right? Low interest rates. But if the credit doesn't actually flow because the financial institutions which provide the credit are too constrained in rebuilding capital, then the effectiveness of monetary policy is hindered. You ask about socialism in Europe, and I think you mentioned President Klaus. I had a very vigorous debate with him recently. I certainly respect what he has done for the Czech Republic, and he's been a leading voice for capitalism around the world. But he's become such a Eurosceptic that I find his views almost intolerable, because he really thinks the only solution for Europe today is to take the euro completely apart, back out of a decade. And I don't think it's either practical nor feasible, to be honest with you. So while socialism, I mean, the notion that socialism is going to come back in Europe, I mean, I don't think socialism ever left. And I think that I do understand some of his concerns. because he, I think, believes that the current effort to support Greece and Spain is misguided. But you either have to, in the end, decide you believe in the European project or not. And I think he simply doesn't believe, and his voice becomes sharper as he gets closer to the end of his term. I appreciate the amplification and the insights shared by the official from the Netherlands. Indeed, I thought the election results did present a glimmer of hope. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it is the first incumbent government that's been up for an election in the Eurozone that's made it through. And I think it's a hopeful sign. It's just that I grew up professionally in the Treasury at a time when the Dutch finance ministry was not just one of the most ardent, but one of the most effective voices for the European project that I knew. And to see the skepticism influencing the policies and to see the barbs coming out of the Netherlands thrown at Greece steadily in the last few years has been a bit difficult. But let's hope that things move in the right direction.
Okay, good. Any other questions or comments? Yes. Okay. Mr. Lee, please.
Hi. Thanks for this morning's session. I have one question. It seems to me that all nations, especially leading nations in the world, including Korea, are facing with growing national debt. And I haven't seen any point in history, or at least recent history, where the government, as they said they are making an effort to reduce the debt, that they actually have done so. Do you see the possibility, or I see the necessity, but do you see the possibility that we can resolve this issue, and what would be the possible consequence in the future of this trend?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, Mr. Lee, I think the longer-term solutions to the debt problems of Europe and the United States and other advanced, mature economies has to be a combination of long-term structural reform, including getting control of entitlement programs, which overwhelm the budgets of these countries. But it also has to be combined with reasonable rates of job creation and economic growth. And I think that this can forge a path. I think back to the efforts to shed the burden of debt which the Latin countries dealt with in the late 80s and early 90s. And indeed, they used the opportunity of the Brady Plan not just to throw off 30 or 40% of their debt, but to revitalize their economic structures, enhance the competitiveness, and move into a period of sustained growth. And I think that has to be the key here, that you allow these countries like Greece and Spain, Italy, some near-term slack, but you insist, if I were sitting in Berlin, on the structural reforms which can bring longer-term budget projections under control and can enhance competitiveness. The Greek debt reduction is a huge opportunity. We eliminated more debt than has ever been done in history, but it will go for naught unless they can reestablish growth. Right now, the Greek economy is contracting at 6 to 7%, and the debt to GDP numbers will continue to look grim. So I think, again, it's a combination of determined efforts over time. It will require, I think, a different breed of political leaders to do this. And I'm not sure that the advanced, quote-unquote, advanced economies of Europe and the U.S. are breeding these leaders. But I think the people are eventually going to tire of a lack of solutions. And the burdens on future generations, particularly given the demographics in many mature economies these days, is quite worrisome. And I think this has to become fed into the political debate more and more as we look at long-term solutions to debt.
Okay. While the others think about further questions, comments, why don't you turn our attention to our part of the world? What's your take on the Chinese economy, and how do you see Korea from your vantage point, and the Korean economy and the Korean politics, and now one of the hot political issue is what is called economic democratization and how that is received by the foreign the community, and particularly from your vantage point.
The economic democratization here.
Yeah, that's what they say, yes.
First a word about China. I'll certainly be better informed next week after spending a week there, and I've got two colleagues with me here who probably know a great deal more than I do. I think there are two different ways to look at the Chinese economic situation going forward. One is in the near term, obviously, one has to be somewhat concerned that growth is slowing much more than many had expected, in large part because of the surprisingly weak export performance. I mean, China has grown as an export machine these last decades, and it's been an export and a joint venture machine, right? And it appears that model is beginning to lose momentum. Now, China has certainly been striving to boost domestic demand and domestic consumption and made some headway in this. But I think China is facing a point where it will need to alter some fundamental aspects of its domestic economic structure. Much more deregulation of the domestic financial system, much more advanced development of social safety nets in order to achieve the kind of development of domestic demand which is really needed. Substantial advancements in healthcare. Obviously, these are not easy things to do, and I think China is struggling to do those. I think more fundamentally is one steps back, the model that has served China so well for almost 3 decades, it seems to me, is in serious need of refurbishing. And it's not clear at all, again, that the political leadership is well positioned to take the necessary steps. We, of course, will have to see with the transition coming in China. And just like transitions in your own country and in my country, we don't quite know what they will bring. But I do think that China is facing a time where it will need to revamp its export industries, revamp the domestic financial system, and revamp the social safety net if it's to continue to sustain its economic performance. And I think it's perhaps not realistic, even with these changes, to expect that the Chinese growth over the next decades will compare with what we've seen over the last few decades. And you've seen this in Korea as well. In terms of Korea, I will have to acknowledge that I'm not as close to your current situation as you are and as I would like to be. I do have the impression that the Korean competitiveness and the overall performance of the Korean corporate sector remains quite high. Mm-hmm. And to me, this continues to be key to the future of Korea. We were having an interesting debate with colleagues and with some other friends, Korean friends, last night about whether Korea has become too dependent on China. I personally think it probably has, although one can dispute that. But I think it is important that Korea broaden its global relationships. It's surprising to me that the Korean economy is not more integrated, for example, with the Latin economies of the world today. And I think this is something that, in looking out to the future, one has to deal with. I think Korea has made progress on developing Seoul as a financial center. Perhaps the progress hasn't been as rapid and as convincing as some of us would like to see, and I think that you've still got a lot of work to do in this area. I think governments really do have to decide whether they're committed to this as a goal. And as we were discussing over the breakfast table earlier, when I see transactions tax on derivatives, I wonder how consistent this is with a country that says it wants to build Seoul as a financial center. I think the issue of economic democratization is one that I need to better understand, to be honest with you, because we see signs of it in other countries as well. And if it's motivated by a growing concern about the gap between the wealthy and the less successful members of your society, I can understand that, but I would certainly approach it with a bit of caution, because I think that there are no easy solutions to these issues of economic gaps. And certainly in my own country, the tendency to point fingers at the wealthy is beginning to, I think, be troublesome from a overall societal and competitiveness point of view. And I for one, am not a great fan of the tendency which one sees in the U.S. today to point a lot of blame at the wealthy. Of course, one needs a fair distribution of tax burdens in any society and a fair set of opportunities. To me, Korea needs to continue to enhance your openness. Over the years, Korea has vacillated in your attitudes toward being a truly open economy. A truly open economy. And you at times show the tendency to be even-handed and treat foreign firms and foreign businessmen as you would your own. And at other times, frankly, you behave in a very, still occasionally, surprisingly protectionist fashion. And no, this is just my observation. Sure. And while I think the overall progress has been one of openness, since I remember the days of seeing small little booklets circulated in grammar schools here that complained about foreigners back in the 80s, and I think overall Korea has grown increasingly comfortable with the notion of an open and competitive economy and society. And I recognize, given your history and your location, this is not an easy thing to do, but I would certainly continue to stress the importance of this for the future of the Korean people.
Good, thank you very much. Unless there are other questions, comments, I think is about, yeah, okay, Dr. Here in the last, yes, question or comment. Yes.
My name is also Kyun. I'm working for Korea Development Institute. Mr. Dallara's presentation is always very eye-opening and very illuminating. So in that sense, thank you very much. Actually, I have one comment and one question. One comment is about the future prospect of Korean the world economy. In retrospect, in the fourth quarter, there's some kind of optimism is prevailing. As you remember, I mean, the IMF is upgrade or something like a little bit upward forecast in the world economy overall. I think because at that time, I think market sentiment is in some sense gave some credit to that the policy efforts of European countries as for that Greek issues, etc., etc. But suddenly in the second quarter, the world economy is plummeted because of the skepticism. But I mean, since I'm a little bit very cautious optimist, so I still believe that this time is different. Where I mean, you know that ECB adopted very ambitious program, and then QE, and another round of QE has been launched. So maybe the market might believe that this time there might be some kind of solution, something like that. So that means that a little bit better prospect than you expected. I mean, well, that's just I want to hear your comment. And another question is that considering this kind of ambitious so-called that QE or some kind of more the provision of the liquidity by ECB, then might induce investors to turn to Asia. I mean, that means that, in other words, we can expect more and more capital inflow, including Korea, in the future, so, right? So that means that there's more appreciation or some more capital inflow to Korea. So Do you agree with that, or I just hear you?
Well, a lot of different issues that you touched upon. Let me just try to deal with two of them. First, I do think there's reason to be encouraged, as markets are, by the recent actions of the ECB and more recently the Federal Reserve. But I would caution that encouragement, particularly vis-a-vis Europe, can evaporate quite quickly if some of the other pieces of the European puzzle do not fall into place. In particular, if the path forward for Spain is not clarified, and in particular, if there is not renewed agreement over another phase of financial support for Greece economic reform. These are two immediate vulnerable points in the European landscape. And if it becomes clear that the spigot of the ECB cannot be turned on because the Spanish government is not prepared to go, then the markets can quickly take back in 3 hours all of the improvement in market sentiment that they've developed in 3 months. And so I think we're approaching a very critical time here vis-a-vis Spain and less so, but also for Greece. You know, Greece will run into serious problems meeting its financial needs by the end of October. Spain will run into serious problems financing its government debt by sometime in November unless decisions are made in both cases. And I think so broad impression created by big battleships is one thing, but actually following through on these other things is quite crucial. Right now, it's very hard to see growth in Europe in 2013. We forecast a very slight uptick from, I think, mild negative growth to mild positive growth, but I doubt that's going to happen unless these problems are dealt with aggressively vis-a-vis Spain and Greece, and also unless they reorient some of these economic programs away from short-term austerity, which I think is part of the problem as well. Capital flows to emerging markets. I think this will continue to be a feature of the world going forward, including to Korea, to Brazil, to China. Obviously, a lot of investors are sitting on sidelines around the world, and obviously the U.S. equity markets remain an attractive vehicle, although Americans themselves are still much less invested today in the U.S. equity markets than they were 5 years ago because they feel burned by the financial crisis, of course. But I think that Korea will have to accept the reality going forward that you will have to deal with substantial amounts of capital flows, and you will need to formulate policy with that in mind.
Okay. Thank you very much. With this, I think we have to end. Mr. Dallara has the schedule today, and he has to leave this evening again to China, and he's globe-trotter, and he's everywhere. Charles Dallara is everywhere, particularly nowadays because of a European problem, which is basically financial problems. So he has to play a very important role. So anyway, we are so glad to have you and sharing with us your very illuminating insight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.